Today we're going to do an app build using the newest Remix template. I know this is something that you guys have been wanting to see for a while, and with time being a bit short lately, I figured the easiest way to do this would be a video walkthrough of the QR code app tutorial on shopify.dev. It's actually a really good tutorial, and the format is much better with this new version. I have gotten some comments about this being a little difficult to understand, and it can be overwhelming if you're coming from little development experience. So this video will be useful for anyone learning Shopify concepts or maybe moving from another framework over to Remix. That said, this isn't intended to be a learn from zero tutorial. You should at least be familiar with JavaScript and React before going through this. All right, so let's jump right in. The first thing we're going to do is come over to our terminal, and we're going to create a new Shopify app using the Shopify CLI. So all we have to do is type in this command, npm init at shopify/app@latest. And that will run the CLI command to create a new project. We'll do the default name, say start with Remix, and we'll just do JavaScript. Okay, so now that that is finished, I'm going to open it up in VS Code. Then in this terminal, I'm going to go ahead and start up the app using npm run dev. We'll want to create this as a new app, so select that option and then select your store and organization, and then we do want to automatically update those URLs. Okay, and we can press P to just go ahead and open that up in our browser. Once that is done, here we have it to install, and then we'll see just the default template app here. All right, and from here we are ready to jump right into the Shopify QR code app tutorial. So in your browser, you want to head over to shopify.dev, click on apps in the top, then you can expand the getting started section and click on build an app. So what this app does is it allows you to create QR codes for products so that when a user scans it, they can be taken to the product page or to a checkout with the product added to their cart. And coming down here a little bit, it tells us a bit about what packages and libraries we're going to use. Of course, we're using Polaris components for the entirety of the UI. Coming down here a little bit, it gives us a list of the packages that we'll want installed. So let's go ahead and do those first. So these three packages, QR code, Shopify, Polaris icons, and tiny invariant, are going to be required for this. So let's just go over to our VS Code again. We'll create a new terminal, and we can install them all at once. So we'll just type in npm I QR code space at Shopify/Polaris icons space tiny invariant. Cool. So we'll install those three packages. And if at any point you do get lost during the tutorial, you can come here to the top of the page and clone the finished repo. So the first thing they want us to do is add a new data model to our database. We are using Prisma in this template, which is basically a middleware that sits between our code and our database to help them communicate with each other. So for things like adding new tables and fetching and updating data within our app, we don't actually have to touch our SQLite database or SQL syntax at all. We can just use the utilities that Prisma gives us to simplify all of that. In our project, there is a Prisma folder at the top level, so we're going to open that and then open this schema.prisma file right here. Every step of this tutorial in shopify.dev is going to highlight the relevant code file and the code on the right here below each step. So we can see here we have the schema.prisma that we're making changes to in this step. And so it highlights the code that it wants us to adjust. So we're going to go ahead and copy this new QR code model and bring it over to our schema.prisma file. And we'll just paste it right down here at the bottom. Adding this model in here tells Prisma what our data looks like, in this case, what our QR code looks like. So we're describing that it has an ID, title, shop, and all these other properties listed along with their types. This is equivalent to us just adding a new table into our database. Now, after adding in that new model, they want us to now migrate the database using this npm command right here. So we'll copy that. Migrations are basically a history of changes we've made to the database and make sure that the database structure is up to date or kept in sync across environments. So since we've added a new model, we can run a migration so that Prisma realizes that we've updated that, and it'll run the appropriate SQL commands to update our database. So back in our code, you'll notice that we have this migrations folder right here. So if we open that up, then we can actually see the migration being added in real time. Right now we just have one. So we'll take that command we copied, we'll throw it here in the terminal, and you can see that it's basically what this does is creates a migration, and then we're adding a name to it as well, which is add QR code table. So we'll run that. And then we can see that we have 2 migrations in here now. This is the one we just added. So now we can open this new migration here. There's a migration.sql file. And if we open that up, you can see it's just SQL syntax for creating a new table named QR code. So which Prisma already ran this and created our new table. So again, this is just like kind of a history of changes we've made to the database so we can carry these migrations around and update our database in different environments and make sure that the structure is synced everywhere. Coming back to the tutorial, they also let us know that we can run Prisma Studio, which will give us a dashboard for our database so we can go through and view that. So let's just do that real quick. We'll come in here, it's just npm run Prisma Studio, and then it will automatically open that up for us. So this is our database. It shows all of our models here. QR code model. You can see the properties or the columns, and we don't have anything in there yet. But yeah, so this will be great for making sure things are working as expected as we run migrations, as we add new QR codes and whatnot. All right, so moving on to step 2 here, we're going to add some code for interacting with our new QR code model. So coming back to our code, we're going to open up the app folder. We're going to add a new models directory, and then we're going to create a new file under that called qrcode.server.js. And this file will house all of the code related to our QR code data model, like reading and updating QR codes. Using this structure is great for organization and separating out logic for all of our data models. So the tutorial goes through this file and it kind of highlights the relevant bits of code, like I mentioned. I'm going to copy this entire file for now and then just go over it in our actual code editor, since it'll be a little bit easier to go through it that way. The first function we have in here is get QR code, and it takes in the ID of the QR code we want to fetch, and then the GraphQL client for making API requests. So this first line is using this database object that's exported from db.server, which if we open up that file, we can see it's just the Prisma client that is being exported. So this Prisma client gives us an easy way to access data from our SQLite database. We can just access the data model as a property, like we're doing right here for QR code, and then the find first method lets us query the table and put in the conditions we want to match. In this case, we want to find the first row in our database where the ID matches the ID passed into the function. We return null if there isn't a matching QR code, otherwise we pass the QR code and the GraphQL client into another function that will return, and we'll look at that in a minute. We also have a plural version of that function to get all QR codes for a shop, get QR codes. This one is very similar. We are querying our QR code data model again, but this time we're using the find many method that Prisma gives us, and we're querying on the shop field and finding all of them that match the shop that we passed in here to the function. And then this eventually returns an array with all of those QR codes after running each one through this supplement QR code function. The next function is get QR code image, which uses the QR code library that we installed to create the QR code image and set the link to a dynamic route within our app at /QRcodes/ID/scan. Next, we have get destination URL, and this is the actual URL where the user will be taken by scanning the QR code. You can see that with this app, there's the ability to set the link to a product page or to a checkout with the product in the cart. So on the QR code data model, we have that destination prop. So that's what we'll be using here to determine where we actually want the link to go to. The next function in this file is the supplement QR code, which is what we saw up above in the get QR code function. So if we scroll back up to that, we can see that we're passing in the QR code that we got from our database. We're passing it through to this supplement QR code function, which if we come back down here, it will take our QR code object from the database, query the Shopify API using GraphQL to get some more data on the product, and then it will return a new product down here with all of our original QR code properties and some additional things from the Shopify API. Then the last function we have here is the validate QR code, and this is just making sure that the QR code is valid by checking that these 3 fields are populated. All right, so that is the entire QR code model we built that gives us basically these list of utility functions we can use throughout our app. Now, going back to the tutorial, we can move on to step 3, which is where we create the actual QR code form to create and update a QR code in our app. So we're going to start by adding a new route in here for this step, and that'll go under app and under the routes directory. So we'll add a new file here, and we're going to add it called app.qrcodes.$id.jsx. In my last video, I talked a little bit about how the file structure and routing works with Remix, but just as a quick refresher, the file names can roughly be translated to routes in the app. So this file, for example, would be found at /app/qrcodes/ID of the QR code. The $sign in this route indicates a dynamic segment, which in our case just means that we can append a QR code ID to this route, and then we'll have access to that ID within the file. So we can fetch and update data for the QR code that corresponds to that ID. So really, we can put anything in the place of this dynamic segment and then just have access to that value within the route. We also have layout files like app.jsx, and you can see how we have these files like app.additional and our new route app.qrcodes. And you can think of these as children of app.jsx because they share that same base. When you create children routes like this, the base file becomes a layout or wrapper file for those children. So app.jsx is just setting up the provider for Polaris for the app, and then this UI nav menu, which is it's a web component from the app bridge utility from Shopify, and this creates that side menu that we see in the admin. Then the outlet component is what renders a child route within this layout. So all of these routes that start with app dot are going to be wrapped in this code. And if you want to dive deeper into some of these Remix specific concepts, there are links throughout this tutorial on the page that you can check out. Okay, now that we have our route created, let's go down to the first point under this step 3, which is authenticate the user. Here it'll start diving into the code. So again, I'm going to copy it and paste it over into our new app.qrcodes.id.jsx. And then we'll just go through the file from top to bottom right here. The first thing we see in this file is the loader function. If you're not familiar with Remix, these are special functions called loader and action, and they are used to fetch and update data for our page. So we use the loader data for fetching data that we want to provide to our route component before it renders, and the action function is for mutations or just anything related to updating data. So within our loader, we have the auth check, which is just a one-liner. We have this authenticate utility, which is provided to us by Shopify. If we come up to the top, we can see that that authenticate is being imported from shopify.server.js, which is right here. And if we go into that, then it's basically just initializing our app, providing that Shopify object, and then all of the exports are down here at the bottom to make it a bit easier. And that's where we get that authenticate utility from. So this authenticate utility that we're using has an admin method on it. We can just pass the request into it, and it will either redirect automatically if the user isn't authenticated, or it will return additional objects that we can use for things like accessing the admin API, billing utilities, and session info. Here we're grabbing the admin object from this return, and we can use that to access the GraphQL client like we do here, just a few lines down. And because this route has a dynamic segment with a $ID like we looked at earlier, we can actually access the ID from the params object like we're doing right here, params.id. So if that ID is equal to new, then we know that it's a new product, and we are just returning basically a blank QR code without any additional info. If it's not a new QR code, then we're going to pass that ID to our get QR code function that we set up earlier to fetch the matching QR code from our database. And by returning the result of this JSON utility, then we can access this data in our route component. And we'll come back to this action function in a minute. For now, let's scroll down to the route component here, the default export, which is the actual form code. We have these two hooks here, use action data and use loader data, and those correspond to the action and loader functions from Remix, and they give us access to the return values. So use loader data gives us the QR code data that we fetched in the loader, and use action data gives us any errors that are returned from the form submission. These next few lines are just basic state variables to manage the clean and dirty states, basically so we know if there have been any changes to the form. Then we have some additional states right here, is saving and is deleting, and this uses the use navigation hook from Remix that gives us info on the network state. So if the route action is being called right now, then it gives us the submitting state, and we can use that along with all the other states we've set up to update the UI based on what's currently happening. After all of this form state, we have the select product function, which if we come back to the tutorial, scroll down a bit, this is referring to this add a product selector step. This product selector is a pre-made component provided to us by AppBridge. So this select product function shows us how we can render that component by calling window.shopify.resourcePicker, and the return value of products here is the end result of whatever product the user selects. Then we can use that selected product to populate the form state. The final piece of the form logic is the submission. So we're using a hook here provided by Remix called useSubmit, which gives us a function we can use to post JSON data to our action handler rather than just passing form data through a form. So in this handle save function, we're taking the fields from the form state and putting it into an object. Then we're using this submit function to post that JSON data to our action handler. And now let's scroll up to the action function and take a look at that now. We first have to authenticate the user again. That's pretty much the first step that'll happen for any action or loader. For pages that need authentication, you'll authenticate the user like that. Then we're going to grab the session object that's returned from that, and we're going to get the shop from the session object. We can get the data from the request by running this request.formData function on it. And then we have the first path that this code can take right here in this conditional. We're able to specify an action type on the request data when we submit the form. So this conditional here is checking if we've added the action prop to the request with a value of delete, in which case we would use the ID in the URL params and delete the current QR code, then redirect the user to the app homepage. If the action for our request isn't delete, we move on with some error validation using the validate QR code function we set up in the QR code model. Assuming all is good and valid, then we either get to update or create a new QR code using the data that we pass through. If we have the value of new in our URL params in place of an ID, then we would just create a new QR code in our database using this create method. And if it's an existing QR code with an ID, then we would use that ID to update a specific QR code, again using this Prisma client and the update method. Now that we have all of the logic covered in our file, we can take a quick look at the actual markup that's rendered for this page. And we are, of course, using Polaris exclusively here, which is really nice. We already have our app running, so let's pull that up so we can use that as a reference as we go through the code. We haven't made any adjustments to the existing template pages yet, so we just still see the default app here, but we can navigate directly to the page that we just created, which was at app/QR codes, and then the dynamic ID. In this case, we don't have any QR codes in our database yet, so we'll just put in new. And here is what our QR code form looks like. So if we look at the markup for this route, we first see the page component as expected, along with the layout. For app pages, these are pretty much always the first components you'll use to set the structure of the page. We also have this UI title bar web component that's provided to us from AppBridge that we can use to create the title bar at the top and add things like breadcrumbs like we see here, and then we can add primary, secondary actions on the right-hand side of the page. The structure of the page is split up between two main parts. We have the wider cards in the main area here in a vertical stack, and then we have the secondary section on the right, which will eventually display a preview of our QR code. The layout component from Polaris is what you use to structure pages. And in this case, what we'll see is a layout.section component for the two cards in the main area. And if we scroll down, we'll see another layout.section with the secondary attribute, which that just puts the content on the side like we see for the QR code preview card over here. The Polaris components themselves are pretty straightforward, so you can check out the docs to dive more into what each of these do, but it's designed in a way where it's super easy to build things the right way, so it meshes well with the Shopify interface. And if you stick to the components, it's honestly pretty hard to mess it up. So checking out the main portion of our page, in the code we have the layout.section, then we have a vertical stack wrapping those two cards. And then for our first card, the content, you can see that we just have a vertical stack, text, and text field components. So, I mean, there's very little code here, just a few components within this card, just basically what's wrapped right here. It fits all right here. And then we end up with this. So like I said, with very little code, stick to the components, and you can build a really nice looking interface. Now looking at this next card, we have the same thing where it's a vertical stack inside for the content. We have the title here. If there is a product ID, meaning there's a product already selected, then it'll show a preview thumbnail of the product image and then have the title as well. If not, then you'll see a button like we do have now, the select product button. And on a click, that will trigger that select product function, which will open the resource picker from AppBridge. So let's test out that button real quick. If we click it, we see this really nice resource picker. We can select a product, and then it adds that, basically fills out the form state like we saw earlier. So now that we have a product populated in the form state, it'll show the thumbnail and the title for the product. Then we have a simple choice list here, so that the user can select their destination. For the secondary card, scrolling down a little bit to this secondary layout.section, it shows the preview of the QR code if there is a QR code image, or it should show this text if there is no image, which I think this code should be checking for QR code.image instead of just QR code, so that this text will show up correctly. So let's change that. Go back. Okay, yeah, and now we see that text show up as expected. Then we just have two buttons in a vertical stack below that. The last thing for this page are these footer actions here. So we have another layout.section for the footer actions, and that uses this page actions component that we can use to save or delete a QR code. And you can see here on this delete button how we can add an action value to our request. In this case delete, and then we can access that in our action handler to do different things within the same action. So with that, this page is complete, and we can actually go through and add a product and create a new QR code. So let's do that real quick, and we'll link it to the product page. We'll click save, and there's our QR code image preview showing up just as expected. And if we go back to our tab with Prisma Studio running, then we can actually open the QR code model and see our brand new QR code and verify that it worked. And back in our tutorial, we're going to scroll down to the next step, which is listing the QR codes. So for this, we're going to edit the default page for the app, the home page. So we'll copy that, and we're going to go to app._index.jsx. Since app.jsx is a layout route, you can specify which route is the default content to load under that layout by creating a _index.jsx file for it. So we're just going to copy over all of that code from the tutorial and paste it into this file. This page is basically just a table where we can see all of our existing QR codes. So of course we have a loader function, and then we're fetching all of the QR codes for the current shop. And then returning that so that we can render the table based on this data. We have an empty state here that'll show if we don't have any QR codes, or we have this QR table, which is just a basic index table Polaris component. And you can see how the row is rendered just down below here. So that will show if we do have any QR codes in our database. Then in our actual route code, we're using the use loader data hook to get the QR codes from the loader function, and then we are passing that into the QR table. So now that we have this in our code, let's go back to our app and just click on the home. And now we have that updated page with our table. We have one QR code and we can see that right here. The next thing we're going to do is add a public QR code route. So this is a route that lives outside of our app routes for displaying the QR code. And since it's outside of the app routes, it doesn't require any authentication because it's not meant to be loaded within the admin, but as a separate standalone page. That's very easy to do with Remix. Looking at our code, we obviously have our app.jsx layout, but since our entire admin app lives under this layout, we can just create a new route without the app.prefix, and therefore it won't be within the layout. So we'll create a new file under this routes directory called qrcodes.$id.jsx. And remember, the $sign indicates a dynamic segment for a route. So in our case, that'll be the ID of the QR code we want to view. Again, we're going to grab this code from the tutorial and paste that into our file. Here we go. So there's not much to this file. We have our loader function, which has taken the ID from the URL and then finding the matching QR code in the database. Then it just returns the title and image for use in our route component down here. These invariant functions that you see throughout the loader and throughout other parts of the code, they just throw errors for falsy values. So it's basically checking that there is an ID in the params and that the QR code exists, otherwise it throws an error. And this route code is very basic. It is just displaying the title and then the QR code image. So let's test this page out. Since it's a public page and doesn't need to be accessed within the admin, let's just go to our version of the app running on localhost. You can find it in the terminal where you started up the app. If you scroll up a bit to the beginning, then you should see a line where it'll have the localhost address right here. So we'll click on that to open that up. Since we're just on the base localhost app, we see this boilerplate default page. We want to go to our new route we just created though, which is qrcodes/1. And then we see our QR code. There's still one more route that we need to add before we can fully test this QR code. So let's go back to our code and add that right now. Since we want to keep track of how many scans a QR code has, we need to have some sort of intermediary route between this QR code and the final product page or checkout that we redirect them to. So we'll create a new public route under this routes folder called qrcodes.$id.scan.jsx. Let's copy that code over from the tutorial, paste it in our code editor. And this is actually an even smaller file than the last one. You can see all it has is a loader function. There's actually no markup returned from this because we're just redirecting the user after we fetch some data. This is also how you can create standalone API routes, which is what this technically is. So just like the other route, we're first getting the QR code from the database that matches the ID for our dynamic segment. Then we find that QR code in the database and we increment the scan property by 1. This is so we can keep track of how many times a QR code has been scanned. After we update that, then we redirect them to the final destination URL, which again is either the product page or a checkout with the product added to cart. If we didn't want to keep track of how many scans a QR code has, then we could bypass this route completely and just send them directly to this destination URL. But since we want to keep track of that, we're going to do it this way and have this route just as a intermediary step between the QR code and the final URL. So with this route added, the only thing left now is to test the entire flow. So let's create another QR code in the app. And then we can go ahead and pull that QR code up and actually test it from our phone. Okay, so now that we've added another QR code, let's test that one out. So if we go back to our local host and now do QR code /2, we see our QR code. I'm going to scan this with my phone, open it up, and it takes us right to the product page. Now, if we go back to our app homepage, we can see that the scan count has been updated. I ended up having to scan it a couple more times. That's why it says 3. But yeah, we verified that's working correctly. And with that, we have a finished QR code app all built directly from the tutorial on shopify.dev. Hopefully this was helpful for you to get a better idea of how Shopify apps work with Remix. I am currently planning a few videos focused on app builds, basically rebuilding common apps you'd see on the App Store. There are some things missing from this tutorial that you would normally see in a real app, like webhooks and billing, more robust database setup. So those are things that I'm going to be adding into my videos in the future. If you have a suggestion of an app build you'd like to see, let me know in the comments below and subscribe so you don't miss any updates. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.